let me tell you about Oliver. Oliver is a young man from Oregon who had a secure job, a 401k, and a cat named Phoenix. He's in his mid to late 20s. He's got a wide, I mean this sort of grin, and eyes that go so wide when he's thinking deeply you can see the whites all the way around. He often refers to himself as an average Joe, and often talks about how he has no significant skills, abilities, or innate qualities that put him above others in any way, shape, or form. Now, among the skills that Oliver does not have, which is worth mentioning, is that Oliver has no idea how to sail a boat. Which for most people isn't really a problem, but it's a big one for Oliver, because in 2024, Oliver quit his stable job, drained his 401k, and bought a sailboat with the goal of sailing around the world with his cat named Phoenix, which is insane and awesome, and I think maybe terrifying. Anyway, whatever else it may be, there is certainly something about Oliver's story and ambition that speaks to us, or at least to me. There's something profoundly human about what he's doing, and I'm not talking about some high and mighty call to adventure. The thing that's really appealing, again at least to me, is that he's doing this with no background at all. Dude's just jumping in and learning what he needs so that he can accomplish his goals, even if that means starting from zero. And according to one of his earlier videos cataloging his journey, it was a real shit show at the start. Those are his words, not mine. We'll come back to Oliver later, but I wanted to kick off this episode with a really extreme example that is central to what we're going to be talking about today, which, in keeping with our nautical theme, I'm going to be calling getting your bearings. If you're listening to this, chances are pretty good that you've got some passing interest in writing. Given the subtitle of this episode, you may even be considering writing your first ever book, which is exciting stuff, and it also means you probably have a lot of questions. Well, I've got good news, bad news, and then some more good news. So, good news. Storytelling is fun. World building, making characters, crafting plots, and adding something uniquely and truly yours into the world is a worthwhile and significant pursuit. I've been hard-pressed in my life to find something quite so fulfilling or satisfying as telling stories and learning how to tell them well. Bad news. It can be overwhelming, maddening, frustrating, slow, and you may often feel like you're genuinely losing your mind. It can be tedious and boring, and it requires an amount of patience that frankly feels inhumane at times. There's always going to be people that are better than you, that are more talented than yourself, and it can be incredibly difficult to find success in this field, whatever success even means. Good news, you don't have to quit your stable job, you don't have to drain your 401k, and unlike sailing around the world, you probably won't drown if something goes wrong. Or at least you won't physically drown. Metaphorical drownings are still very much on the table. But being overwhelmed is part and parcel of starting something new. And if you're willing to put the time in, you can make something really special. Stretching our nautical theme even further here, this podcast aims to be a lifeline for new writers and a resource you can revisit as you develop and work on bringing your manuscript to life. So let's get started. And let's get started by first talking about what your goals are and defining them. We'll start with what a book even is. Yeah, we're going to go that basic here, but bear with me. There are different kinds of written works, and definitions get a little wonky pretty quick, but the metric used generally to categorize a given work is word count, not page count. You can sniff out a new writer pretty quickly if they're telling you how many pages they've written and not how many words they've gotten down. The average novel and nonfiction books have a minimum word count of about 50,000 words. Anything less is usually categorized as a novella, down to about 17,500 words, then a novelette, and finally a short story, which caps out around 8,000 words. Why do we use word count and not page count? Well, because page count varies widely depending on formatting, while word count is consistent and objective. Now, like I said, these word counts are loose definitions at best and can vary wildly depending on certain factors. For instance, a fantasy or sci-fi novel that does a lot of world building or scene setting typically has upwards of about 90,000 words minimum. That's why you get authors like Brandon Sanderson or James Islington publishing books that look suitable for cinder block construction so regularly. While, say, a contemporary romance novel looks more like something a normal human being could conceivably read in a couple of sessions. If you're writing nonfiction, these rules are even more nebulous, I'm afraid. But we'll tackle that in depth later. So why should you care about word count? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, if you're aiming to write a novel, it's good to know what target you should be aiming for. It helps with knowing how much you need to reduce the story, which ultimately helps you judge your pacing. If you're clipping along too fast, or if you've spent way too much time on a certain scene, it's a good tool to have, especially as you develop your skills. Secondly, if you're looking to publish your work, it's good to know what exactly you're selling readers. If you're looking to publish traditionally, then agents will ask for the word count in their query letters, generally speaking. If you're self-publishing, then you need to be able to set readers' expectations before they buy your book. If you're advertising a novel but selling a novelette but charging novel prices, you're going to undermine the confidence of your audience and they may feel cheated. You don't want your readers to feel cheated. Okay, so we've defined the kind of book that you want to write, and we have a rough goalpost of how many words that's going to take. Time to get started, right? Well, maybe. Let's talk about how you're going to write. And no, I don't mean physically, like keyboard or pen and paper. What I mean is, are you going in with a plan? When you start exploring the writing world and writing communities, there are two archetypes of writers you'll hear talked about a lot. They are the plotters and the pantsers. In my nerdy brain, I like to think of them as knights and chaos goblins. Knights, or plotters, map their novels out neatly before they begin writing. They have a plan and they stick to it. They have highlighters and notebooks coming out of their ears. They've read books on the craft. They've studied the hero's journey in Freytag's pyramid, and they have charts and graphs and tracking character arcs and development. Everything's color-coded and labeled and organized, and you get the idea. Their characters get on the story train, and there's no unplanned stops, no sightseeing, dithering, lollygagging, lingering, lurking, or laying about. And then there's the Chaos Goblins. Well, they just do shit. They start with an idea, or a character, or a scene, and then they just sort of follow it. There's no pre-planned structure, no guiding star. They'd probably go into anaphylaxis at the sight of a highlighter. There are only two things that plotters and pantsers have in common, and that's a pulse and the notebooks thing. An abundance of notebooks, by the way, is one of those few constants that transcends all writerly differences. It's kind of like how all humans have an inherent desire for belonging, or how every time you make pancakes, the first one is going to be an unmitigated disaster. Some things are just always true. And speaking of things that are always true, you know that thing that people do? You know, where they identify themselves with one group of people or one way of doing things, and then there becomes like this tribal animosity towards anyone that does things differently because somehow different became equated with wrong. Yeah, well, surprise. You'll find that here too. Plotters can view pantsers as lazy and uninformed, while pantsers can view their own approach as the truer form of art. Famed pantser Stephen King is famously quoted saying, "Plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice." Ouch. But hold on. Before you go burning your flowcharts and surrendering your sticky notes lest you be perceived as a dullard, let me point out that J.K. Rowling plotted all of her books, and Harry Potter is regularly featured in articles talking about the most read books of all time. Usually it's featured just below the Quran and the Bible. So maybe the plotters versus pantsers discussion shouldn't be so focused on the theoretical superiority of one over the other, but rather framed as a question of preference. I know, crazy idea, but maybe worth a thought. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't pros and cons to each approach. Plotting can lead to a more cohesive first draft, leading to fewer edits later on. It can also be easier to keep track of the story elements and threads you're trying to weave through the whole work. But it can also be restrictive to the point where it impacts the quality of the story, making it feel stilted and stiff. However, the biggest downside to the plotting approach, in my opinion, is one that I don't hear talked about that often, and I think it's because this particular drawback is a little more insidious and hard to see, especially for younger writers. Let me explain. There is an important difference between writing your story and writing about your story. When you're writing about your story, you're spending a lot of time developing the world and the plot and where you want things to go, which, as we've established, is not a bad thing on its own. But it's very easy to get sucked into a sort of limbo, where you're spending a lot of time and a lot of words on a project that isn't actually going anywhere. Excessive plotting can give the illusion of forward momentum. And when that illusion inevitably breaks, you'll find yourself sitting at the starting line, which is disheartening to say the least. Over the years, I've talked to several would-be authors who've written literal tomes of material about their world, their setting, characters, and plots, and yet haven't written a single word on the actual manuscript. I know of one woman who's been working on the same draft for nearly 2 decades, 20 years, but has never finished her book because she keeps going back to her world-building document. Preparation is great, plotting is fantastic, but unless you're actually working on the book, you're effectively just packing for a trip you're never actually going to take. We'll probably talk more about this idea in a later episode, but I think this danger is important enough that it deserves a shout out here too. So the next natural question is, does pantsing have similar drawbacks? Of course it does. They just look different. Pantsing offers more creative freedom, is excellent for getting words on the page, and is a great way to get draft 0 on the table quickly. The reckoning comes during editing. My first ever novel was written, for the most part, in the pantsing style. It was a fever dream of following characters, being surprised by their actions, being surprised that I was surprised, and writing. Then came the day that I wrote the last sentence of my first book, and shortly after that, all hell broke loose. I have never cursed another human being as much as I cursed myself during that whole editing phase. I essentially rewrote the entire novel upwards of 3 times, and I promise that's not hyperbole. I'm talking about total overhauls, complete restructures. Sometimes the only things that stayed the same were the names of the characters, and even some of those were changed. It was a nightmare. And by the end of it, I promised myself that I'd never even dream of doing a full pantsing run ever again. And I still haven't. Or at least I no longer do pure pantsing runs. But I never fully embraced the full plotter approach either. And honestly, that sort of puts me on the level with most writers I know. See, the more that I'm out in the writing community, it becomes clearer that most people aren't fully plotter or pantser, but some combination of the two. That's certainly the case for me. When I write my books, I treat plot like lattice work, and my characters like vines. I have the structure, but how the characters navigate it is up to them. There's room for surprises and movement, but there's also a clear path on what I want to be and how to get there. At the end of the day, my advice is just to try both and see which you prefer. In the end, finishing a book is the goal, so whatever approach works best for you is best for you. All right, so we've talked about defining the thing you're writing, and we've talked about some different plotting styles. Now let's talk about the deed itself and the process of actually putting some words on the page. Now, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but I may have hinted once or twice that writing a book takes time. How much time exactly depends on more factors than I can count, but I'll use myself as an example here. I wrote my first book of about 80,000 words over the course of about 3 years, and it took another 3 years to get it into a state where I felt comfortable publishing it. I wrote my second book, just over 60,000 words, over the course of 6 months. I wrote my third book, roughly 125,000 words, in about a year and a half. I'm currently writing my fourth book, and at the time of writing this script for this episode, I just passed 25,000 word mark, after about 3 months of work. Now, I don't mean to present my own writing pace as the gold standard for how long it should take to write a book. The reason I share the information is to be descriptive, not prescriptive. It might be that your book takes longer, and that's perfectly fine. Author G.R.R. Martin isn't exactly the Usain Bolt of authors, but I think it's fair to say that he's done all right for himself. Conversely, there are many writers like Stephen King whose sheer volume of output could probably rival a Xerox printer. The important thing when you're writing a book is consistency, routine, regiment, schedule, which is all well and good to say, but what does that actually look like? Well, that depends on you. Look, this isn't the type of podcast that's going to tell you to get up at 4 a.m. and put on the Sigma grind set, or whatever the hell they talk about on those shouty self-help podcasts. All I will say is this. Look at your current schedule, find a time frame and a place that's suitable where you can crank out a few words. Then do it again and again. If doing that means you're getting up at 4 a.m. because that's your quiet time and you're the special kind of crazy that likes being awake before God and decency, then go for it. If you're a night owl and that's when you're able to write more freely, then do that. If you're in a season of life where things are crazy and upside down and you're just trying to stay afloat, then write what you can as you can. When I was writing my third book, I was working a full-time job and taking college classes. I had no time ever. So I started writing what I could during my 30-minute lunch breaks at work. Was my progress slowed down as a result? Of course. But even if I was slow, I was at least consistent. And as a result, I wrote the damn thing. And now that damn thing is sitting on my bookshelf with my name on it. That wouldn't be the case if I didn't have a routine that helped me to put words on the page. And that's really what it boils down to. Whatever gets words on the page. Progress is progress, no matter how you slice it. Now, remember Oliver and his cat named Phoenix that I talked about at the top of this episode? Well, after a little over a year of learning the literal ropes, learning how to repair his boat, how to navigate the open ocean, and stocking up on cat food, he set sail. On May 31st of 2025, he landed in Hawaii, having successfully navigated the Pacific Ocean. Oliver's story might seem extreme or even wildly reckless, and you're not going to catch me saying otherwise, but I think there's a lot to learn from it and from him. It's about trusting yourself enough to take that first step, even if you don't have all the answers. It's about embracing the chaos, learning, failing, adjusting, and doing so with perseverance. Because in the end, writing your first book, or any creative pursuit, is a lot like sailing across the ocean. Unpredictable, sometimes turbulent, but ultimately rewarding for those who keep their eyes on the horizon and their hands on the wheel. Is it called a wheel? Rudder. On the steery bit. Remember, whether you're a plotter or a pantser, your process is valid. What matters most is that you keep moving forward. Set realistic goals, carve out dedicated time, and don't be afraid to stumble. It's through these imperfections and challenges that you're going to find your own unique rhythm and marathon pace. And if it's overwhelming, and don't worry, it is, just think about the story you're trying to tell. Every word, every sentence builds towards the final destination. A story that's entirely yours. Writing is not just about creating a manuscript. It's about discovering and sharing a part of yourself with the world, and I think that alone makes the effort worthwhile. I've been Olivia Curtis. Thank you for listening, and